Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Mike James. He's the CEO of Avalonia. You know, I've had Avalonia on the show before, Mike. I had Stephen Kirk on. I've had fans of Avalonia. What a joy. Maybe start with the reason that it's called Avalonia. What's the origin of the name?
Oh, so the origin of the name is obviously WPF. The code name was Avalon. Avalonia is, it's a homage to that. But there was also, it was originally called Perspex. So if we kind of cast back 10 years when we're 10 and a half. And I think that, when I was 10, I used that half a year really counted. So I used to tell everyone. So we're 10 and a half years old. And it was called Perspex, but that turned out to be trademarked. So at some point there was a discussion with the community about new names. And Avalonia is a homage, as I say, to Avalon.
Now, were you there at the beginning when this all started?
No, I'm a late starter. So back when Avalonia started, so Stephen created it, who you've spoken to and you know. He created it in 2013 as a pet project, always open source and on GitHub. And around 2013, I was just getting into Xamarin. So I think I just started to work at Xamarin as a support engineer. So I've been doing cross-platform, but I wasn't aware of Avalonia until about 5 years ago, where I needed to port my own WPF app to go cross-platform. And so I was Googling around and I found this technology and I was like, this looks really interesting. And I kind of dived in and discovered an incredible community and decided I want to help this grow.
Yeah. Stephen was on show 684. Folks can go to hanselminutes.com/684 and check out that original. That was 5 years ago. And then I had Dan Walmsley on a couple, 3 years ago talking about how he was using it as well. And when you say community, like there's a ton of people that are excited about this. And I love discovering apps that are written in Avalonia, but there's no real way to look at the app and tell other than it just works.
Yeah. It's a benefit of open source that anyone can go and get started with it. But the negative is we just don't know who's building with it half the time. The technology itself, Avalonia, it's got, I think, 403 contributors. If we look on GitHub today, it's almost 26,000 stars, 21.5 million builds since January, about 70,000. Wow. Yeah, it's a lot. And it's growing. So 70,000 active monthly users, and it's about 20 to 30% month-on-month growth. In terms of like the stats, the community is constantly growing. We're always learning of new apps that are being built with Avalonia. And it's really just so rewarding to see that.
I love that you're still discovering how these things work. It's interesting in the space of open source, though, because, you don't want to you can't really put in telemetry unless people opt in. So you want to know how people are using it. But the only way you can really tell is that they're pulling your NuGet packages, right? There's no way to call them and say, hey, I saw that you are using my product. Tell me what cool stuff you're doing with it.
Exactly that. And we've got telemetry and we've got metrics that we use in order to gauge engagement. Like there's tools like orbit.love, which help us get a feel for community engagement on GitHub. But yeah, it's that challenge of often we'll only discover that someone's building with us when they've hit a problem.
Oh, so they call tech support and then you're like, oh, we didn't know that company A or company B is using it, but they called in and now we're friends with them and we can help them be successful.
Precisely that. And it's really nice to be able to build these relationships with these businesses because, they're looking for long-term support and stability in their tech products. We're very much an enterprise solution. We've been here for a decade. We've got a roadmap that kind of looks out to the next decade. So to be able to create these relationships with customers like Unity and OutSystems, they kind of become friends, a lot of the customers.
That's cool. So backing up for folks who may be wondering what we're talking about, WPF is Windows Presentation Foundation. And that was always written by Microsoft with the assumption that it would run on Windows. And I understand from my conversations with Stephen that they really baked some serious assumptions about how applications should work. Baked in, because it's always assuming Windows. And you're always assuming not. And that must be a very complicated technical challenge for you to bump into.
So from the Avalonia perspective, it was always built to be cross-platform. So there were decisions made to be WPF-like. So if you're using the open source technology that we've built, if you've ever built a WPF app, then you're already an Avalonia expert. you're not going to be able to copy and paste 100% of your code to Avalonia. For example, dependency property in WPF is now Avalonia property, and we use generics. So like you're going to have to change some code. But there was a lot of demand from businesses to have a cross-platform WPF because they've got these mission-critical applications. And I'm loath to use the word legacy because it's not really legacy. Like, they're critical applications for these enterprises, and they're stuck on Windows. I'm on a Mac. A lot of the people I meet are using Mac. When we look at other markets around the world, there are some markets, there are demands from governments to move to Linux and to move away from Windows. So there's a huge opportunity there to help these enterprises with that kind of modernization story.
Yeah. I've talked before and blogged before. You may have seen the post on dark matter developers, right? The kind of the quiet developers that are out there, and we're having conversations with them, but the conversations are not on social media, right? So we over pivot on social media because we hear loud people being loud. And then we assume that those are the people, like they're the people, they're using the product, and they must be who we should cater to. I've heard people call it Twitter-driven development. But the reality is there's a lot of space between the stars, and you've got one or two people yelling on Twitter about something, but then there's like 100 developers that are just doing their job, making great software, working at big companies that we all have heard of. And I feel like those are the people that are kind of thanklessly building great WPF applications. And they just need to know that there are options.
Exactly that. And I think that's been with XPF. We announced it last year. And for context, XPF is our cross-platform WPF. So that's like 100% compatible. I like to say it's binary compatible, but the engineers tell me off when I say that. So if your third-party dependencies will work with XPF, you don't have to recompile them for XPF. But we announced that last year. And when you think about our marketing and our messaging, our biggest challenge has been awareness, getting people to understand that it exists and that it's an option and that they don't need to rewrite in some new technology. They don't need to go to the web or rewrite in Flutter. They have a modernization strategy, which is kind of a couple of hours work, and you're now on Mac and Linux.
Yeah. When things line up cleanly, that's when interfaces really are magical. Because in this case here, WPF is an interface. It's a surface area. Some of it's high level, some of it's low level. But when you go and you make a reference to a WPF library and you start calling their APIs, you make a lot of assumptions, and you have now a dependency. I'm understanding you can swap WPF out, put XPF in. Now it's not Windows Presentation Foundation, it's cross-platform Presentation Foundation. Your app still thinks it's talking to WPF, right? Like it's a lie, but it's a wildly successful lie.
Exactly that. So we forked WPF. It was back in December 2021. Nikita, who is our resident genius, he is by far the smartest man I've ever met. He is so incredibly bright. He took WPF and he started building it on his Linux PC. Just getting it to build at all was a challenge. But yeah, he got it building, and then he set about replacing Milcore, which is the WPF is kind of 3 tiers. The lowest level is unmanaged code. It's a compositional renderer for WPF, which uses DirectX 9. That's what's been replaced. So Presentation Core and Presentation Foundation, they remain largely untouched, and your application sits on top of those. So yeah, in terms of your application, it thinks it's running on vanilla WPF. And all of your dependencies, Telerik, Syncfusion, DevExpress, they think they're running on WPF as well.
Yeah.
So when it works, first time, it genuinely feels like magic.
Yeah. I think that one thing, just to get into the weeds, the technical weeds for a second, Milcore, Milcore, is a thing that people don't think about when they are thinking about WPF. When you think about the major components of WPF, you think about presentation framework, you think about presentation core, which sit on top of the CLR. But then Milcore kind of slides in underneath the CLR, but above DirectX, and it makes WPF so fast. It makes that DirectX relationship possible. And that's all written in unmanaged code, right? So getting that to work is like magical. And that's part of the lie.
We replaced it. We just, delete that and then throw in Avalonia. So, it's
just delete that.
Yeah, I mean, you need about a decade of work to build a cross-platform UI framework and an advanced compositional renderer, which we've got in Avalonia, in the open source stuff. So we just slide that in. And then you spend like a year, 18 months, just working away to resolve the differences in rendering.
Right.
And do you know, if it's 100% WPF your app, which I've yet to see a 100% WPF app, but if it is, then it works with no problems, and it's really like 30 seconds. It's when you've got those third-party dependencies, which are really, most of the time, using GDI or their WinForms,
right?
But you're using that from SAML. That's where it becomes a bit more challenging, and that's where I think the engineers really enjoy, because it's like deep in the weeds technical stuff to get those controls working.
This is a great example of why I don't like it when people use the word just to refer to someone's hard work, right? Because I love that you said that like in jest. Oh yeah, you just spend 10 years making a high quality cross-platform, open source system, and then you just spend another 18 months, right? But the reality is, in order for it to look like magic, a huge amount of work needs to happen. And what's the old joke? Like any sufficiently advanced technology is distinguishable from magic. Anything that is sufficiently abstracted away is indistinguishable from magic. So in this case here, you're writing Windows Presentation Foundation code. You, meaning me, the dark matter developer who just wants to write an app, and then it lights up. It lights up cross-platform. And the fact that you all at Avalonia took that under your as your cross to bear, and Microsoft didn't, is really cool, because I suppose someone at Microsoft could have done that, but chose not to. So this is an opportunity where you then forked WPF, which you couldn't have done if it hadn't been open source, and then started running.
I mean, we're built on the shoulders of giants. Like, we have to acknowledge the fact that Microsoft was very gracious in making WPF open source. Microsoft was gracious in creating .NET to be cross-platform. Before that we were running on Mono, but the fact that we have a really fast runtime that's getting a lot of love. We're excited about what's coming with Net 9 later this year. Like, we couldn't have done this without what Microsoft have provided to the whole community and ecosystem at large. But yeah, it's entertaining to go back and look at some of the old threads around people asking on GitHub, can we get a cross-platform version of WPF? And the answers were, no, it's impossible. And it's like, it's not impossible. It's just an awful lot of work.
Yeah, there is nothing impossible. There is a famous blog post that was written, I think, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm curious what you think about this. It's very geeky. It says, Win32 is the only stable ABI on Linux. ABI is an application binary interface. And basically it's saying, if you want to be successful and have your apps run everywhere, you might as well just write a Windows app, because that's the only thing you can count on. Because if you do a Linux port, you're going to be playing whack-a-mole with all the different versions of Linux and all the different versions of glibc and all that kind of stuff. And even Valve, who supports Steam, has said, don't even bother porting something to Linux. Just write a Windows app and we'll take care of it with whether Proton or Vulkan or whatever. It seems like the same thing is applicable within the context of XPF. If you have a Windows app, it's WPF, you're in a great spot. Is that a true statement, and that kind of a sad statement?
I think Linux is an interesting OS. I've tried it a few times as my desktop. I normally manage about 48 hours before I reinstall Windows. I just don't think I'm smart enough for it. The guys, Nikita, for example, will happily sit and rebuild his kernel because he wants to install some random audio drivers or something. It all goes over my head. But yeah, Linux is a challenge to support. Like, we have particular distros that we support, like, the standard ones, Ubuntu, Fedora. But we made a sale recently of XPF to a large, absolutely huge compared to us, Chinese conglomerate. They're running on a Chinese flavor of Linux. I think it's Deepin. And then they're running on some hardware that you can only get in China as well. So it was ARM-based. So that, makes things even more complicated for us. But because of the way that we work, it's Avalonia under the hood. And Avalonia doesn't require too much from the underlying operating system to work. as long as we can get like keyboard and mouse like inputs, and we have a canvas to render to, then we've pretty much got everything we need to work. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge to support all the different flavors of Linux, but it's easier for us than if we'd gone down the route of, trying to abstract GDK or some other Linux UI framework. Drawing everything ourselves and owning that whole stack makes life just a bit easier.
Yeah, that drawing everything yourselves thing is really interesting, because I was doing in 1990, I want to say 1996 or 1997, I was at Nike doing Java, and it was write once, debug everywhere, and everything was called owner draw, because basically you didn't have an app, you had pixels. And that seems to be a really interesting philosophy around cross-platform. There's two ways to think about cross-platform. Use their controls and try to make the thing pretty everywhere, or just say, forget it, and then just draw the controls. What's the Avalonia philosophy?
So we draw everything ourselves. So we own the entire rendering stack. This is a much more difficult approach, I would say, in some elements, and much easier in others. Like, there's pros and cons with every technology choice. One of the most difficult things with this approach is handling stuff like fonts. Like, rendering text is incredibly difficult. We're really lucky we've got a guy called Benedict on our team who was like specialized just on text rendering. But yes, having a consistent UI across all of the platforms is a huge benefit, and having just one rendering stack that works the same across every platform is a huge benefit for us. Now, we sit on top of Skier. You don't have to use Skier. You can use DirectX on Windows as well, and it's pluggable like that low level. So you can pick, and we may implement new low-level renderers in the future, but the only native control is really the window that we're drawing into. And there are some platforms like Embedded, if you're running on a HMI device where there's not even a window, we're just pushing pixels to the frame buffer on Linux.
Pushing pixels to the frame buffer on Linux. And doing that, though, does it make an app look like Linux, or does it just make a pretty app? And it's really on the responsibility of the author to make it look nice everywhere, because within the frame is going to be the same app. It's going to look pixel perfect everywhere. So if I want it to feel right, that's on me, and that's probably okay.
Well, so if you're using the frame buffer, then you don't have a desktop environment. So you're just a screen. So this is like for those HMIs, so the human machine interfaces, which is typically like an industrial touchscreen. Mm-hmm. One of our big customers, Schneider Electric, they adopted Avalonia for their Harmony HMI devices. You Google them, you can see that they come in a variety of sizes, and I believe it's for their automation systems. So the Avalonia app there's no desktop environment, there's no file pickers or anything like that, there's no window decorations.
It's a kiosk.
Exactly that. It's a full screen application.
Nice.
We can run on very minimal dependencies. Like, we don't need GDK. You can basically just install the Linux kernel at the lowest level, and then a couple of extra dependencies, and then your Avalonia app will run on top of that.
That's pretty crazy, and it just works. That's Yeah. Now the website, I was teasing a friend who works at Avalonia earlier, because the website says you can do a port in 30 seconds, and that can't be true, but it kind of actually is true, which blows my mind.
I've seen how fast you can type, so I think you could. It's I think mileage may vary. So to get a port working with XPF, you just update the CS proj. So you're going into the top line, which is your project SDK. You're going to change that from, I think it's Windows.SDK to XPF. And then you add your license information as a property within the CS proj. And assuming that you've already set up NuGet before, because we ship in a private NuGet feed, then that's the only change that you need to make. Your app is now ready to start testing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so it really can be 30 seconds.
Yeah. So I'm using the example of like Baby Smash. Baby Smash was a game I wrote for my son. He was on my lap, and I wrote a game where you slap the keyboard and it uses WPF to do really crazy stuff. And at the time, it was quite revolutionary. This is 18 years ago. You would use custom fonts, and they would spin, and they had gradients, and you'd go, Baby Smash. I could just compile that against XPF.
You can. So I actually took Baby Smash yesterday to have a look.
No, you didn't.
See how I did. I've got some feedback for you, Scott.
Uh-oh. 18 years ago, you were a bad developer.
Well, no.
Well, yes.
Well, no. So here's the thing, right? So if your application is 100% WPF, then that 30 seconds boom is just going to work. But your application isn't 100% WPF.
No, it calls a bunch of P invokes. It cheats and it calls
Exactly.
into Win32 APIs that actually some of them were undocumented, as I recall.
So that makes life a little more interesting. So you've got dependencies on WinMM, which I guess is for audio stuff.
That's because I didn't know how to play audio. I wanted it to sing and play Baby Smash. I didn't know how to play a WAV file.
Yeah, well, that makes our life slightly more challenging than it needs to be. You've got dependencies on user 32, and then I think you're using speech synthesizer as well. So, and in terms of the XAML, if we look at your main window.xaml, it's 106 lines of XAML. So, it's not, in terms of the UI, I don't think your problem for going cross-platform is rebuilding the UI. I think your cross-platform...
It's pretty basic,
yeah, I think your challenge is elsewhere. So we could take your app and make it run on XPF, but we would need to re-architect some of the approaches. So we would probably want to use dependency injection in order to pass in a cross-platform way of playing audio, for example. So that on Windows, we could keep using WinMM, but then on macOS, we would use the native macOS APIs, or maybe we'd go and find a cross-platform audio playback library that we can use everywhere. Yeah. But for your app, because the complexity isn't existing within that UI level, you're going to have to do some work to get it to run on Mac and Linux. But for other customers or other users of XPF, often the most complex part is the UI. They've got dependencies on Telerik or DevExpress, hugely complicated user interfaces, and the platform integration is very minimal. They might be using the registry, which is super easy for us to provide a shim for that so that it just works.
Yeah.
But yeah, the key problem that they have is the UI, not the other bits.
Right. In the case of Baby Smash, I've done similar work to try to port it, and it really is quite simple. You just need to start commenting stuff out. So anytime I do something dumb, you comment it out. Baby Smash was interesting because it would prevent the user from Alt F4. It would try to grab, so I grabbed the keyboard, and then I had speech synthesis, because if the kid typed a word accidentally, like they typed dog, but they're baby, it would stop, recognize that was a word, and then say the word dog. So I would need speech synthesis. You could comment that out. And then I needed to play WAV files. And I'm sure we could find a simple API to play WAV files. So you would basically pound define your way to glory.
Yeah.
And then you'd do a build, and 3 different binaries would pop out: a Windows, a Linux, and a Mac.
Exactly that. So actually, I managed to get your app to build and run on my Mac. The only bit I actually had to comment out was speech synthesizer.
Yeah. Because you got to go and find the APIs to do that.
Exactly that. So once I commented that out, it built, and it was pushing pixels on my screen.
And how long did that take?
It took me maybe 5 minutes tops.
I was looking for an hour and a half, but no, that's pretty cool.
I mean, commenting out code is easy.
Commenting out code is refactoring via subtraction. That's the best thing. That's fantastic. So 5 minutes to get Baby Smash. And now, by the way, the baby is going to college this year. So, but the application lives on. And I literally see people doing this, talking about Baby Smash even now when their babies get born. So this is pretty cool. I love that the baby's going to end up being 30 and there's still going to be babies born. We should definitely do this. So let me ask you this. Is it only Mac, Linux, and Windows? Maybe I want to do WebAssembly.
We have internal builds of WebAssembly. So targeting Net 8, we need to do some refactors for the new threading model for Net 9, because WASM is kind of an ever-moving beast. So yeah, WebAssembly is working. We have Perfview. I don't know if you know that app.
Perfview is great.
Yeah, we have that running in the browser. That's pretty exciting. We also have iOS and Android coming. Again, internal previews. We see more demand for browser, which kind of makes sense. But yeah, we kind of focus right now on the desktop side of things. We've got 1 or 2 engineers focused on WASM, and then mobile is kind of the forgotten child right at this second.
But all these things are possible. Like you said, it's just a matter of doing a lot of really hard tech. And it's all possible.
It's definitely all possible. The challenge with WASM is that browser's the most locked down platform. It's actually really difficult to build for. You've got threading considerations, and when you think about how dialogues work, And on browser, they need to be async, but that's not going to work with your standard WPF app. And then you've got single view. Most WPF apps are going to open a window, and how do you deal with that in a WASM application? So yeah, there's considerations and problems that we need to solve before we're happy to start shipping that to people, but we're working on it.
That brings up a really interesting point, which kind of is a callback to the beginning of the conversation, where when they make assumptions, when they said the W in WPF, it wasn't just about APIs. It's also about interaction models. So there's a modal dialogue. There's a modeless dialogue. This is full screen. This is not. That's not a Windows thing. It's just kind of a UI philosophy. So you're going to port this, I understand, to Samsung Tizen, which is a television. And if someone brings up a modal dialogue box, they're going to make assumptions about what can you switch away? Are you waiting? Are you spinning waiting? Like all of these things are going to need to be re-implemented.
This is a really interesting point, and it's something I've been talking about for years at this point. There is, I think, cross-platform. There's cross-platform, and then there's cross-paradigm, and they are not the same thing. And if you want 100% code reuse, you must hate your users, because there is no way that 100% of your desktop application code is going to work well on an iPhone, or is it going to work well on your television or in the browser? You need to understand that the way that the user is going to interact with your application is unique to the device and operating system that they're using. And so we encourage code reuse, but I personally don't want to see 100% code reuse. If you're using 100% of your code across every platform, then you're doing it wrong. You're shipping subpar experiences to your users.
That's a great point, because I think people love to say that, but they're asking the wrong questions. That's not what you want to do. You think you want to do that, but you really don't want to do that. And you're right. It is about the balance. If you can get maybe 70 or 80% code reviews, then you're doing a great job, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you can get even higher than that if you architect well. But I just think that, the general way of a desktop application, I look at my Mac with Catalyst and I see Apple, I consider them to have infinite resources at this point. Mm-hmm. Some of the newer apps that are on my Mac are just iPhone apps. And the experience, it's subpar. It isn't as good as it used to be when people were building apps using AppKit. I don't want an iOS app on my Mac. I want a genuine, complex, native Mac application, desktop.
Avalonia is open source. It's open core. XPF is an add-on that you can pay for. And we talked about enterprise developers, but what about me? I'm an indie developer. Baby Smash does not make a lot of money, nor does it have a lot of users. Is there a solution for me?
Well, because it's you, I'll give you a free license. I'll comp you one. But for your average Joe, I think we need to be honest about the fact that XPF is funding Avalonia. So we're a small team. We're about 9 people that are working full-time to build Avalonia, and that's expensive. And we've historically generated revenue from services, so support agreements with large enterprises and porting their apps to Avalonia. So XPF is really a way for us to generate the revenue to allow us to focus on building more for the community with Avalonia. So there's been a lot of asks around, can you make a free version or can you make it open source? And I'd love the answer to be yes, but we're not in a position to do that because we're not VC backed. We're a bootstrapped small company. So we created the indie tier because there's a demand from smaller companies and some individuals to have XPF. But when we look at the total number of WPF apps and then the slice that we're targeting single-digit percentage of the overall market because we want most people to eventually use Avalonia. XPF is like a stepping stone to app modernization. It's kind of helping those customers and users that right now they don't have the ability to spend 3-4 months plus porting to Avalonia or a new tech. They just need to get onto macOS and Linux quickly. They pay the price for that, and that in turn helps us to go out and build more features for Avalonia on the open source side.
Very cool. Well, you've made a special landing page for Hansel Minutes listeners. You can go to avaloniaui.net/Hansel Minutes. You can check out XPF, do a 30-day trial. But again, Avalonia Core, you can go and check that out. Look at that. That's all open source. But I encourage folks to explore avaloniaui.net. It's really cool. And I am super impressed that you were playing with Baby Smash before our chat. Thank you for doing that. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Mike James.
Thank you.
We've been talking to Mike James from Avalonia. Check him out, avaloniaui.net. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.